Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan, and we are here to talk straight. We have a wonderful guest with us today, and I'm going to introduce you to Mark. And Mark, if you would please tell everybody your full name, how you like to be addressed, and a little bit about yourself, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. It's great to be here. My name is Mark Ottinger. I'm an attorney in Burlington, Vermont. I have a background in, among other things, cross-border international trade, and I know that that's one of the topics on the conversation for today. I've lived in Burlington for the bulk of my professional career since, I think, 1982. Grew up on 4 continents in a UN World Bank family. Had a father who was actively involved in international trade. And we bought a vacation home in central Vermont in 1966 when I was 11. And that's what caused me to settle here in the state of Vermont. After graduating law school, I practiced briefly in Woodstock after clerking at the Vermont Supreme Court. And then I moved to Burlington. And I've had a career where I've spent essentially 8 or 10 years in 3 or 4 different positions, 3 different firms, punctuated with a period of time as General Counsel for the Vermont Education Department initially, and then agency, and now I'm back in the private sector since 2014, and so I do a lot of international law. I do a lot of federal criminal defense work, and I do a lot of cross-border stuff. So that's basically me. So
you also taught?
I have taught at Champlain College for approximately 15 or 20 years as an adjunct in their business law division. When they were just a 2-year college, we had just a straight 3-credit business law course. They then became a 2+2 college where they would actually readmit folks for a bachelor's degree. And at that time, it was felt that it would be necessary to have a Business Law 1 and a Business Law 2. So I sort of incubated Business Law 2 and eventually ended up teaching a specialty 1-credit course, prepping people for the CPA exam.
Good. I should have taken that course, I guess.
Well, I think back in the day, there was a business law component. I think that's no longer the case.
It was when I went. So we had business law.
Well, that was a lot of fun. Champlain was a great place to work, and I live right around the corner. I then started teaching at Vermont Law School, where my focus was on international trade, import, export, foreign investment, transnational law. When I was first asked to teach transnational law, I had to ask what it is. And I was told that it's just basically, cross-border stuff broadly conceived.
Okay, that's interesting.
Including things like, international enforcement of judgments.
Okay.
Extradition in the criminal context, and so on. So that's kind of my teaching background, and my writing sort of began extensively with the Vermont Bar Journal. Sort of, they publish several times a year, and back originally it was focused a lot on international transactions. And so even though Vermont is a place where it's not easy to be an internationalist from a law standpoint, to the extent that it's something I'm passionate about, something that I have an academic interest in, and so I've always kept up with it.
Well, clearly Vermont needs it because we need to bring in that international business. We need to start to generate outside of just Vermont. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, and I'm going to let you kind of go into areas that you'd like to go as well, but if you don't mind, for our listeners, if we could talk a little bit about the basics of tariffs, since everybody's hearing that across the news, and there's panic, non-panic, and we know there's a whole political positioning. I'm not so much interested in the political positioning. I really would like our listeners to understand, what is a tariff? How does it work? And then we can get into how it's affecting Vermont, if you don't mind.
Sure. It's a big topic. So a tariff essentially is a tax on goods coming across international boundaries. It's sort of the antithesis of free trade. So if you are going to purchase something, let's say you are in Vermont, you're going to purchase something, say, from Europe. At the border, you have to declare the value, You have to declare the nature of the goods, and then you go through something called the harmonized tariff process, whereby the good is classified, and it's a 10-digit number, and each pair of numbers is another sort of subclassification in the taxonomy. And once you've classified the good, and you've determined where it is coming from, and there are some pretty complicated so-called rules of origin in terms of, because everything is now made everywhere. And
Right, I was going to ask you, because how do you isolate where it's coming from? So there's like a blend, so those codes keep getting broken down, is that it? Or is it?
Yes, because you may be importing, let's say, a clock, and that clock may be a wind-up clock, or it may be an electric clock, or it may be a wall clock, or a wristwatch, and each one of those subsets of timekeeping devices has a different classification and may be subject to a different tariff rate, depending upon where they come from. So one of the things that we have is, from some countries we really can't import. Take, for example, a place like North Korea.
Okay.
Nor can we export. And there are certain types of goods that are restricted in terms of importation or exportation. For example, if we have a software company that makes encryption software,
right,
which would be in the hands of, let's say, some country that had interests antithetical to those of the United States, encryption software might be used against us. So there are some very strict restrictions on that point. So there's some things, some goods that can't pass, some countries with whom we do not trade, and then there's sort of everything else. And everything else, when it comes into this country, or reciprocally when it goes to a foreign country and is received there, American goods, there's essentially a tax or a tariff, depending on the classification of the item. Then we have certain regional favorites that we might work with, for example, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is, started as the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement back, I think, in 1987, and then was increased to include Mexico in 1994 to create the world's largest multinational trade bloc. And for the most part, goods that cross our borders, either from Canada to the United States or from Canada to Mexico or any permutation of those three countries, travel largely at a reduced tariff rate or at no tariff rate. Now, there's some notable exceptions, and I'm sure we're going to talk about softwood lumber.
Right.
And countervailing duties and stuff like that. But so essentially, tariffs are a tax that gets applied to goods when they cross the border, depending upon the nature of the goods, where they're coming from, and who the buyers and sellers are.
So you mentioned about certain, exemptions, certain areas we cannot trade with, how we have the codes, if you know or you may not know. So treaties, so do we have some type of treaty flipping going on here? So like if I want to work through a country that we do have an agreement with, I can go through the back door and do behind the scenes to get my product through? Is anybody looking at that? How is that playing out?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with treaties specifically addressing, say, international trade, but we certainly have sort of favored nation status.
Okay. Can you explain to the listeners what that is?
Well, for example, goods coming to and going to or coming from the European Union, which I think is currently a blend of 43 countries.
Right.
We have relatively strong relations with Europe. They also engage in trade-related practices that are consistent with what I would say United States values around trade are, in terms of being environmentally responsible, not using child labor, not basically subsidizing, because some nation states subsidize certain sectors, industry sectors from a strategic standpoint, and the perception might be from the United States' perspective that when let's say softwood lumber is coming into the United States from Canada,
right,
there is, and I'm not sure how much of this is factual and how much of it is anecdotal.
Understood.
But there are subsidies in Canada that the national government and the provincial governments, most importantly, offer to their sawmills, so that the raw materials, the logs essentially, can be acquired by the sawmills at a subsidized rate, or so it is thought. So when spruce, pine, and fir, SPF, which are the three types of softwood, enter the United States. Originally, we negotiated, speaking of international agreements or conventions or treaties, we negotiated a softwood treaty agreement that limited the amount of Canadian softwood lumber that could come into the United States by quotas. And the purpose of that, I think, was to protect, or perceived to be to protect, U.S. lumber interests. Now, of course, I think if you compare the natural resources in Canada to the natural resources in the United States, specifically related to trees and lumber, the United States doesn't have as much lumber production as it once did.
Right.
So there's less to protect. And so I think that the quotas, you can still exceed the quotas. In other words, more SPF, more softwood lumber could come from Canada into the United States than is permitted under the quotas. But once you exceed those quotas, you end up having a relatively high import duty. And so what it does is it supposedly levels the playing field between U.S. sawmills and Canadian sawmills to make it fair. And that's the concept of what's called countervailing duties, where a duty is imposed to try and offset an economic or financial benefit that a non-U.S. manufacturer, in this case sawmill owner, would have.
So we now have this whole situation going on with tariffs, right? We have our Canadian relationships, and we have, and of course, I'm always going to ask a question, if you know, please. Is the tariff situation going on with the president, is it legal? I mean, are there issues here that are not legal in the way the use of that tariff declarations are going on?
Well, that's a good question, whether basically imposing tariffs or reducing tariffs or eliminating tariffs is something that is exclusively within the purview of the executive branch, or whether it's something that requires congressional approval, federal legislation. I haven't researched that point, and I would be reluctant to offer a definitive opinion. Okay. But I do think that it is intrinsically federal government authority to govern international trade. I mean, we here in the United States have what we call a limited federal government. The federal government only has those powers that are given to it by the states, originally back when we became a country back in 1776. And, you know, every time one of the states joined the existing 13 colonies that became the United States, it essentially acceded to the terms of the United States Constitution. And to the extent that there was an abrogation of states' rights at that point, that was part of the deal of becoming a member of the Union. So international trade, commerce, international or interstate commerce is the constitutional term. To the extent that something touches on interstate commerce, it is inherently federal, and therefore states, for example, cannot impose duties. There was a relatively famous case, I think, in the state of Washington, where the Washington state wanted to sort of provide an advantage to its apple crop. And so they wanted to tax apples coming into the state of Washington that were not grown in the state of Washington, and that was clearly determined by the courts to be a violation of the interstate exclusive federal subject matter jurisdiction. But as far as does the President of the United States have the power to unilaterally change tariff rates, it's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but certainly the impacts are profound. If you look at the United States and Canada as trade partners, clearly we are Canada is our biggest trade partner, and we are Canada's biggest trade partner. If you add Mexico to the mix under the North American Free Trade Agreement, you've got, as I said, the most robust and sort of complex and overarching international, multinational trade agreement in the world. And so if you suddenly change the balance and you suddenly start charging, Canadian manufacturers more or American manufacturers more for goods that are crossing that border, it obviously disrupts pricing, which takes time to adjust to, and usually gets passed on to the consumers. or you start disrupting things like bricks and mortar and jobs.
Okay, there you go.
Because a lot of things in the United States, just thinking about the Canadian-U.S. border, or let's be more sort of specific to Vermont and Quebec. One of the biggest areas of international cooperation economically is the so-called the aviation and space technology.
This is where we're going next. Yeah.
Right. And so there is manufacturing that occurs in the United States. There's manufacturing that occurs in Canada. There are jobs that are related to each other. It's sort of the supply chain crosses that border. And until recently, or still, I guess, for the moment, essentially we've treated it from a business standpoint as almost there not being a border there. And so, you can think of particular manufacturers. I think Bombardier used to be one as an example. And when suddenly it becomes more difficult or more expensive to move people and or goods across an international boundary, industries that have essentially developed their infrastructure, developed their job structures and so on around an assumption about stable tariff structure, suddenly they're sort of placed in a position where profitability is placed in question. And, ultimately, so there's a lot of impact. So getting back to your original question, I'm not sure that I can answer your question as to whether the president actually has the ability to unilaterally set tariffs or whether there has to be congressional approval. My guess is that the answer is the Congress could always essentially trump, no pun intended,
right,
a decision from the administration, but that initially, traditional historic adjustments to customs duties and so on are something where deference is probably given to the executive branch.
Right, I would think so. I agree with what you're saying. Of course, I'm not an expert on this area, but I would think that there is, the executive branch has the authority to pretty much make those decisions, and then Congress can step in and try to find the legislative loopholes. And then, of course, there's the vote, and if they don't have the vote, it doesn't matter, right?
Right, and whenever you have a situation where the federal government perhaps lacks the subject matter expertise, what they tend to do is they tend to create a broad framework legislatively, and then they empower the executive branch, specifically various agencies and so on, who have or which have expertise in that particular area. They basically defer to that agency to create rules, administrative regulations that are in the Code of Federal Regulations to implement the sort of broad policies of the federal legislation. Right. And so and then again, to the extent that the courts are asked to weigh in on the, is this tariff, consistent with federal legislation? Is it consistent with constitutional limitations and so on and so forth? That is something that could ultimately be deferred to the courts, and the courts will, quite frankly, usually defer on policy matters to the agencies, which are given the authority by the legislative branch to act accordingly. And so that's generally how that tends to work.
So we have now in the state of Vermont, small airports. The aviation industry, we're hoping, will be developed appropriately. Of course, it's very difficult to do that without having, say, anchors in the different airports.
Yep.
And the tariffs, do you think that what's going on now is going to have an impact on the aviation industry here?
Well, one of the interesting developments in Vermont vis-a-vis aviation, of course, is the development of electric planes. Okay, and it's the beta experience in Burlington. And one of the things that I, as a Vermonter, have seen recently is the notion that Beta has been, I think, developing a footprint across the lake in Plattsburgh. And one of the things perhaps we have a chance to talk about here today is our free trade zones. Good,
and we should definitely go into that right after this question.
Because we will talk about that, and my understanding is there is a free trade zone. It's, the acronym is the FTZ at the old Plattsburgh Air Force Base, I believe, and we'll talk about how those work. But I think that because of the fact that Vermont has a lot of existing investment in aviation, in aerospace, and now with electric planes, I think that tariffs that could affect the aviation industry are going to be particularly delicate when it comes to the efficiency and the profitability of some of the industries that we have here in Vermont, and I would assume some of the industries that we are hoping to grow strategically.
And also, we have a lot of customs issues going on at the airports and, Border Patrol, et cetera. So it's all going to start to blend, and we're going to have different areas that are going to have a huge impact. But I would like to talk about the free trade zone, and if you could run with this, it would be fantastic.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because when you're talking about airports, I mean, I don't really know what the culture is in terms of the enforcement of the harmonized tariff code in the context of an airport. I can tell you that, at the border, when we cross back and forth at Highgate or a place like that, and we watch the trucks sort of being set aside and so on for that, so that it can be determined, what is it that you're carrying? What's the value of what you're carrying? What's the country of origin? Let's apply the tariffs. That same process certainly occurs when something comes into the United States through another port of entry, which could be the Burlington Airport or any one of our local airports. But if you want to talk about free trade zones.
I do.
So go ahead.
I definitely want to talk about that. I'd like you to explain, we hear the terms and we think, free, we hear trade, we hear zone, and we believe that our constituents, our listeners understand what it is. Okay? And I'm not so sure that everybody really does understand what is a free trade zone. I mean, people hear free trade zone, it's like, just go on in there and have at it.
Right.
And that's not exactly what that means.
Right. A free trade zone, boy, it's a complicated subject. It is essentially an area where goods can sort of appear to come from a foreign country, come into our country geographically, but not be considered to be landed in the United States for purposes of application of those duties. So if you have a particular product, let's say, that is subject to a 15% duty, and you're a U.S. company, and you want to get your raw materials from Canada, bring them into the United States, and then remanufacture them and send them to a third country. Let's say send them somewhere to the European Union. When you bring in the goods from Canada or the raw materials from Canada into, say, Vermont, if you work on them in a free trade zone, which can be a building, it can be a building with a lot of land, depending on what you're doing, you do not have to pay the duty as long as you promise that the goods, once remanufactured, will not so-called break customs, will not actually be sold or used in the United States, but rather will simply be remanufactured and then re-exported. So it is a way to allow domestic manufacturing to bring goods, materials, raw materials into the state, not have to pay an import duty, have the advantage of the jobs and the bricks and mortar that allow it to remanufacture that and then export it further. And it's, in a sense, never deemed to have been in the United States for purposes of imposing that 15%
So like a
duty.
drop ship.
It's like a drop shipping, essentially. That's correct. And I'll give you a quick example that I recall from my career, which is that there was a time when powdered milk was being manufactured in Canada. And the dairy industry, I think, is one of those areas where there's exceptions to the free trade agreement between, the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement and now NAFTA. And so there was a fairly significant tariff imposed on the importation of powdered milk from Canada into the United States. It was being used, I believe, in federally funded efforts to provide milk for nursing mothers overseas through federal money, such as USAID money.
Okay.
And so what was happening is the Canadian powdered milk was being hydrated. It was a very simple process, hydrated in the United States in a free trade zone and then being shipped off to Africa for distribution. Now, setting aside the issues as to whether that's good policy, whether you're, because to the extent that it may usurp breastfeeding, that's a whole nother issue. But there was an example of how to basically bring in a raw material, add value to it, re-export it without having the imposition of that duty. Now you might say, well, why not just abandon the tariff on powdered milk coming into the United States altogether from Canada? And the answer is that people at the policy levels much way above me may have some reason for exempting that. But one way to get around it is to use a free trade zone as a drop shipping place,
right,
if you will, and then shipping it beyond.
So what do you know how one becomes a free trade zone? I mean, is there a specific criteria? Do you kind of have to like say, hey, pick me? Or, I mean, is there a huge application process? Do you need to be near specific waterways or airways? I mean, is there a criteria for this?
I'm not an expert in this area. There's one person in Vermont, I won't mention her name, who is, I think, the ultimate expert in FTZs. And she's worked for 2 or 3 different companies in Vermont that have utilized FTZs for strategic reasons. Essentially, the purposes of the regulations around free trade zones are to make sure that the underlying principles are not abused. In other words, that the goods can't suddenly, come into this FTZ and then be remanufactured and then end up in the United States after all.
After all, right.
Right. And so you have to, the assurances, I mean, things like, things as sort of trite as chain link fences around the building in question, a robust system of inventory in and out. Making sure that we make sure that when that powdered milk comes in and it gets remanufactured, it's all accounted for, and then when it's re-exported, that is all tied together, so that the incoming and the outgoing all balance. But yes, there is a package of information. It's funny you mentioned, is there a big packet? It's about 3/4 of an inch thick. Last I saw a shrink-wrapped copy of it. Essentially, it's a shrink-wrapped thing, and you could, back before you could download everything, you could actually get a copy of it from the U.S. Department of Commerce. And it's like anything else. You have to go through a process of essentially having your plan vetted, and then having the implementation of your plan, the creation of your free trade zone, checked over by the appropriate regulatory authorities, and then periodic reporting to ensure that it wasn't just built according to spec, but that it is operating consistent with the rules regarding free trade zones.
So pretty much like everything with the government, it is the people having to have that trust that the compliance will be in place.
Yep, I'd say trust and verify.
Right. So, and the oversight, regulatory bodies to make sure that they do come in and do their checks and balances, and to make sure that I'm intrigued with the whole remanufacturing process and how you get around it. And have we had any cases, do you know, where there has been lawsuits or some issues regarding manufacturing that didn't meet the criteria and was being resold elsewhere?
That's a good question. I don't actually know of any cases, but I would be almost certain that they exist. And I would suggest that the frequency of their existing is highest in situations where the customs duties that would be implicated are on the higher side rather than on the lower side. Because if you're dealing with a good that is going to have a 10 or 15 or 20% customs duty on it, that increases the financial consequences of or the potential, let's say, profitability of violating the law. I'm not aware of any instances in which the regulators have found that any free trade zones in this particular part of the country have operated illegally. But you're right. I mean, it's you start with customs duties, which are, in my opinion, intrinsically inefficient, and then you build systems to get around them. There's a good argument as to why have them in the first place. And the answer may be, I think the answer is somewhere because even though for whatever reason, we may not want to allow powdered milk into our country because it competes with our dairy manufacturing. And yet we also want to allow, say, people in Vermont to be able to have jobs remanufacturing or hydrating the milk as long as it's not going to be adversely affecting dairy farms in Vermont.
Right.
And so there's a carve out. But again, so you've got customs duties, which on the one hand are a bit of an inefficiency inserted into the commercial stream, and then you have workarounds. I am not a macro economist, but I would say that the more you try and sort of control the market, the less efficiency you're getting.
The less efficient it's going to be, right. So when we have this free trade zone, we have job opportunities, right?
Sure.
Then when we have these job opportunities, it opens up opportunities for people from all over the region to come in and work. Do they have different requirements, if you know, and I'm just getting so intrigued by your answers, so I'm thinking, do they have different requirements job-wise, job criteria, if they're in a free trade zone versus not?
I don't think so, because no matter what, let's imagine that it's literally a building on an acre of land surrounded by a chain link fence.
Right.
Okay, and that's a simplistic approach.
Understood.
You could actually have a floor of a multi-floor building that would be set up as an FTZ. I think that when the Vermont worker or the upstate New York worker or the New Hampshire worker enters that free trade zone, clocks in, clocks out at the end of the day, and has been doing whatever they're supposed to be doing, whether it's taking a particular raw material and making it into a product or hydrating powdered milk or whatever, they leave at the end of the day. They get paid for the hours they work. They have certain benefits. I don't think that the nature of the people who work in the free trade zone, it's no different than if they were working, doing economic development in Newport, Vermont.
Okay.
For the city or for the town or for a private sector. But jobs are jobs. Right. And so the more, manufacturing we can incentivize to take place in Vermont, I think the more our economy will benefit.
Right.
We look at places like, not to pick on Springfield, Vermont, but that used to be the machine tool capital.
We can pick on Springfield.
Well, I mean, it's a lovely place, but it's really amazing to see all the mills there that once were filled with manufacturing that no longer are.
Right. We drive through there and we see those buildings, and it's like you want to just go back in time and
Right.
see what was going on and how it was going and why it was vibrant, and then all of a sudden just
Right.
stopped.
Well, and it's fascinating, and it's sad in a sense. I mean, there's this juxtaposition between, I guess, manufacturing and the concerns about the environment. And that's obviously here in Vermont. We want to preserve our bucolic quality. We want to preserve the character of our real estate. We want to have jobs. We want to have clean environment. And to some extent, these two things sort of work at cross purposes with each other. But there's no question, of course, that we're facing a significant demographic decline that we've been seeing for probably now 25 years. I mean, I know it in the context of education, having been general counsel at the agency, and, there was one time probably 30 years ago now that we had over 100,000 publicly educated K through 12 students. We've now actually added 2 years of pre-K. And yet our total publicly educated cohort is under 80,000.
80,000, right?
And so, I was watching the news last night about the economic or the demographic problems in Japan. And that is a truly profound problem. And, when you look at our population here in Vermont, which has been pretty much steady at 625,000 for as long as I can remember. And so you might say, well, at least we're not losing population. But the other factor is that we are an aging population.
Well, that's what I was going to say. We're not losing, but we are changing.
When we're losing workforce as
Right.
a result, and we're also losing kids. And so again, when you look at the per pupil cost of education, and you look at the fact that we have fewer students in places like the 4 southern counties in the state of Vermont.
Right.
And so what happens there is, of course, the infrastructure is in place. It's really hard to get rid of educators, partly because the community it's done at the community level. and local folks don't want to turn away essentially long-standing teachers and administrators in the local school system. And so even if the economics of it were to justify, let's say, fewer teachers, that is politically a very difficult thing to do. And when you have salaries and benefits occupying 80 to 85% of the cost of education, and if you're not, your infrastructure is still there, your class sizes are getting smaller and smaller, and the economics of that, again, if your per pupil spending goes up, the way we tax homesteads in the state of Vermont is a function of per pupil spending at the local level. And to some extent, it's borne statewide.
Right.
That's the Brigham decision, but to some extent, it's
Right.
also the more you spend, the more you pay locally. It's just been
the
dampened,
imbalance, right.
dampened somewhat.
So I don't know how familiar you are with the governor's proposal from education.
A little
Have you
bit.
been following that?
Little
What's
bit.
your thoughts on that without taking a political position and saying, we're not here to do
Yeah.
a rah, 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 I love this.
Right.
We just kind of want to know a little bit about what your thoughts are on this.
Right. I think in the more populated parts of the state, the counties that seem to be the most robust economically are basically Franklin, Chittenden, and Addison.
Correct.
Along the lake. I would think that in those counties, this is going to have the proposals will have a positive effect. There's talking about closing smaller schools. But when you get, again, I don't want to pick on the 4 southern counties.
Right.
But one of the things that's going to happen there, if you start closing small schools, is that transportation between home and school gets increasingly further. In Vermont, school busing, is not mandatory. It's optional. And it's also expensive. And so what do you do if you are a let's say, 2-earner family whose kids go to a local school, and let's say you have no busing, or let's say you do have busing, either way, and suddenly they close your local school. So instead of driving 5 miles to bring your kids to school or having them bus 5 miles, it's suddenly 25 miles. So instead of spending, let's say, 5 minutes in the car every day each way, your kids could be spending, twice 45 minutes on the bus. And so I think that so 2-earner families are going to have a real significant challenge. Like, what do you do? Does somebody not work? Does somebody work less? How does it disrupt things? What if you've got, because of the decreased number of schools, what if you've got some kids that, one kid in an elementary school nearby, and you've got another kid in a high school that's in the other direction? Now you're affecting both parents, or you're affecting more time on the school bus. So I think that the governor's plan, as I understand it, of essentially more of a block grant type system.
Okay.
This is something that we have had in the past, where, every school can expect you're going to get so and so many dollars per student, budget accordingly. That's not necessarily a bad model. But the problem is that in the context of a decreasing student body and fixed infrastructure costs and really hard to move salary and benefit costs,
Right.
I think it's going to be tough. And so
tough.
I see it in the context of my practice of sometimes parents coming to me with kids who are identified for special education and saying, we don't think our child is getting the special education supports that he or she needs based on his or her disability, and as are required by federal law under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, the IDEA. And the reality is that we're bumping up against unaffordability, because if a local school district decides that a child who has significant special ed needs ought to go to what they call therapeutic school, or perhaps even a residential school, I mean, instead of spending $20,000 a year per child, some of those programs can cost $100,000 or even
Correct.
$200,000.
You're absolutely right on that big jump up.
Yeah, and so what's happening these days is that, there's always a degree of sort of dissatisfaction regarding how kids with disabilities are being served. But these days, there is this dynamic tension where schools are almost out of money in some respects, so they want to spend less. From a political standpoint, school boards are inclined to spend less because it's politically unpopular to spend more. And so you then have this situation where some kids with learning disabilities, there seems to be a tendency now to keep those kids local and to provide special ed services on campus, if you will, of the public schools. This is a sort of retrenchment or a change. Sort of the tide came in, the tide is now rolling back. There was, over the course of, say, the last 30 to 40 years or whatever, an increased utilization of out-of-school district placements. That's a bit of a technical, loaded term there. But at this point, there's...
Polite one.
Yeah, and a technical one. But nowadays, the pressures on the schools and the real estate tax costs, which are driven directly by education spending or largely by education spending, those pressures are, I think, resulting in what a child with a learning disability is entitled to. That expectation or that free and appropriate public education, it's called a FAPE. Concepts of a FAPE are evolving. And I think that we are no longer going to be able, I hate to say it this way, but to be able to afford the quality of special education that we've become accustomed to.
So do you see us going back to those who have a learning disability years ago? They were not mainstreamed and being forced to go into areas where they're not really being mainstreamed anymore for affordability purposes?
I think that inevitably there's that tendency is something we can expect to increase, because in order to mainstream certain types of people with disabilities, they require, say, a 2-on-1 or a 1-on-1 who would be a para-educator that would actually be specifically designated to assist this person all day long, or maybe these two people all day long. As you can imagine, having an entirely 1 FTE additional person to hire, with salary and benefits, that's probably another $50,000 of cost just attached to that one child. And so to the extent, is that going to be less of a deliverable? Is it going to be just from an affordability standpoint no longer possible? I think so. And I think it's going to be a give and take and a pull and tug, and we will eventually get to a new normal. But yes, I think that mainstreaming is something that is going to suffer as a result of our demographic problem.
So the school boards have their own trustees, the local school boards. If in fact, and they like that control, right?
The local control.
And it's most of it is they're elected. Officials sometimes appointed if nobody gets selected, right?
Right,
And
to fill a term.
A bill, right? Exactly, right? So what's your feel for, is it better to have the state have more of an influence on the school boards and how it's monitored? Or do you feel that leaving the elected officials in place to make those decisions is more productive for the school districts wherever they end up?
Well, it's an interesting question. Let me go to the far extreme.
Okay.
In most countries in the world, school policy, education policy is federal, let alone state. But in Vermont, we have a very, very strong history and culture of local control. So when you ask the question, should some of that local control essentially be ceded to the state? I would ask the further following question, which is, should some of the state control be ceded to the federal government? And I think the answer is that, at least in Vermont, anytime you try and adversely impact or perceive to be adversely impacting local control, you run into a tremendous amount of pushback. Vermont historically has had the smallest school districts in the country. Until we started consolidating school districts about what's it been, 15 years ago now?
Yeah, Act 46.
46,
right.
49, all of that stuff. And until then, I mean, our average school district size was 300 students. A place like Los Angeles, they have a district with 50,000 students.
Right.
So when you think about, can you really have, a board, a budget, all the necessary votes, an audit, for 300 kids, and then you do that 250 times. That's part of what drives up the cost of education. As I said, one of the problems we have is a very structural problem, is that we've got too few kids chasing too many seats.
Too many seats, right.
But beyond that, in terms of administration, the governor's plan apparently calls for 5 districts, as opposed to the current, 160 or so. Back when I was at the agency, we had 250. So there was quite a degree of consolidation that occurred. But again, much of that consolidation occurred in places where it was easy to consolidate, in areas where, the more concentrated population centers. In the more rural areas, which have these transportation problems, which have, a variety of issues of that sort, they have trouble, for example, finding special educators. They have trouble finding administrators, people with superintendent's licenses, principal's licenses, and so on. I think that the dynamic sort of pull and tug between local control and state control is always going to be there. I know that the governor's plan is more focused on eliminating some aspects of local control, and yet, as I understand it, it also contemplates school choice, which is another sort of very interesting political hot potato. Because one of the questions is, if you have school choice, will you go to, let's say, a private school? They're called independent schools in Vermont. And what impact does that have on the public monies, if you will?
Vouchers.
The vouchers and so on, yes. Because if you have choice, and if you decide to go to what's called an approved independent school in the state of Vermont, which is a designation that the State Board of Education attaches to a particular school, there are a bunch of criteria in the law that require you to have, appropriate number of teachers and administrators, and, that your independent school won't discriminate and applies all the, Section 504 and, public access laws and so on. If your school obtains approved independent school status, and there are about, I think, 125 approved independent schools in the state of Vermont, if you have school choice, you can basically send your child to that school, that independent school, and your local school district has to basically cut a check for the tuition. In the case of, if you have school choice, and let's say the school district in which you live doesn't operate a school at your kid's level, you have school choice for that child, and you can choose from among any of the public schools that are nearby, or maybe not so nearby. That's your choice as a parent. Or the parents can choose from an approved independent school. If the parents choose to send their kid to a public school, whatever that public school's announced tuition is, that's what your local school district has to pay. For an independent school, there is an average elementary rate and an average high school rate that is just the statistical blend of all the public school rates, and that's the number. So there's some approved independent schools that actually charge more than the average announced. And for those schools, parents have the choice of either sending the school there and augmenting the tuition that the town pays to make up the difference, or not. And of course, that raises issues of equity.
As well as the actual licensing and criteria for the teachers.
Right,
as
that's
well.
true too.
So that's an entirely different animal unto itself. Because if you work for the independent schools, there's a different criteria than what's going on at the state level.
That's true. Independent schools, approved independent schools, do not have to have licensed general educators. Per federal law, they still have to have licensed special educators, because that's mandated by the feds. So independent schools still are supposed to have faculty that are qualified by training and experience. And those are some of the criteria that the State Board of Education looks to when they decide whether or not to approve an independent school. And it's also worth noting that there was a recent case in Maine, somebody versus Macon, or Macon versus somebody. It's escaping me right now, but that was a case in which Maine's system is kind of similar to Vermont's in a way. And there were parents in that context who had school choice that wanted to send their children to a so-called pervasively religious school.
Okay.
And that used to be prohibited because the U.S. Supreme Court, as it was constituted, I don't know, 10 years ago and more, basically felt that the anti-establishment clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is a clause that basically says the government shall not basically establish religion. And the way the courts interpreted that was that if the government pays a religious school tuition, that's establishing religion, and therefore the government could not do that. So, give you a couple of examples: Mount St. Joseph's in Rutland,
Right.
Rice in South Burlington. Those were deemed to be pervasively religious, and there's a whole bunch of, law around what's pervasive and what's not. Mm-hmm. A hint of religiosity is not a disqualifier.
Right, right.
But under this Carson versus Macon case from Maine, there's no longer a prohibition against government paying tuition to pervasively religious schools, because the current majority on the U.S. Supreme Court believes that it would be a violation of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment to prevent parents with school choice from sending their kids to be educated to an approved independent school. Mm-hmm. It's got to be approved for quality, not, but one that is pervasively religious. So now if you live in a school district that has school choice and you want to send your kid to Rice, no more problem.
No issues there anymore.
Correct.
And what about, we have down south, we have in Manchester, the Burton, that quasi-independent public style, St. Johnsbury, right? We have it as well.
Yep.
So they are most probably not as eager to have the governor's plan go forward, because they like their model and their control, and they think it's working just fine. Do you think that they will really be affected if most of their with school choice or do you think that they are just a different animal unto itself?
Well, let's incorporate the other two. So there's St. Johnsbury Academy, there's Linden Institute, there's Thetford Academy, and there's Burton. Correct. So there's four. They're sometimes described as quasi-publics.
Right.
I think that's a misnomer, because under Vermont education law, a public school is one that has a publicly elected school board. And so that's an easy way to think about it. And so the so-called Big Four independent schools have private boards. So they're non-public. However, they serve in parts of the state that are largely unserved by public high schools.
High schools.
And therefore, so if you're not served by a public high school, that means that a higher incidence of the population has school choice. So, for example, in St. Johnsbury, the vast majority, St. Johnsbury does not have a public high school. So anybody who lives in St. Johnsbury can send their kids to St. Johnsbury Academy at government expense. And I will tell you that St. Johnsbury Academy's tuition is a little bit higher than the average announced, but there's a specific statute in Vermont that essentially allows them and Linden Institute to charge full tuition.
Full tuition.
And that is perhaps out of a sense of necessity, because there really isn't an alternative in those areas. Now, the two obvious, nearby schools, one would be Danville, which is still a high school, and one would be Concord, which closed. And it was closed by vote of the electorate in Concord, Vermont, a number of years ago, just because it had fewer and fewer and fewer students and was no longer financially sustainable. Do I think that the big four, let's just use the academy as an example, are going to be adversely impacted? I don't think so. I think their interests are pretty well protected in that context. I mean, if we have, well, I would leave it there.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. I wanted the public to understand that they were there. Mm-hmm. They had a different model, mm-hmm. and that they still had influence on the educational criteria going across the state. Mm-hmm. But, you know, if there is no high school, mm-hmm. pretty much they get the money regardless, and you can go there. What I would like to do now, if you don't mind, is flip back to the international trade. Mm-hmm. I'm really curious where you think, from economic development, how do we get more economic development going from international borders into Vermont? Okay. This is a tough one.
It is a tough one. I mean, it's a wonderful place to live. From a doing business standpoint, one of the things that I've always heard is that the cost of electricity is high. And so to the extent that you have a manufacturing concern that is highly dependent upon electricity, that would be a sort of checking the box, a negative in terms of relocating to Vermont. Now, one of the things that I've been personally thinking about when I look at the balance of what is it that we get from Canada and what is it that Canada gets from us, one of the things we get from Canada is, I think, 25% of our electricity.
That's correct.
And so one of the concerns that I have is that if the trade wars actually result in an increase in the cost of electricity in the state of Vermont, that is going to be a further disincentive to relocating, let's say, good paying, clean jobs to a place like Vermont. And so another issue that, again, I'm not a macroeconomic person, but another issue that I know is that many states will give tax holidays to industry to come into their state. So, for example, waiving state income tax, corporate income tax for a period of time, or waiving real estate tax if it's a large concern. And one of my favorite stories to tell is that, and for all of the pluses and minuses, is when my son went to college at Auburn in Alabama, and when one flies into Atlanta and then drives the hour and a half or so to Auburn, just as soon as you, I think, get across the Georgia border, you come across this massive Kia factory, car manufacturing. Sure. And I don't know how many thousands or many thousands of individuals work at that factory, but it's out in the middle of nowhere. It superficially is clean manufacturing, many jobs. The character of the land is similar in the standpoint. I don't recall seeing billboards. I don't recall, seeing a lot of, ugly high-rise development or anything like that, or smokestacks. And so there's an example of a manufacturing concern that I believe was brought there by state incentives. And I wonder whether in the longer term, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, but that Vermont making very intentional effort to try and make itself welcoming, financially welcoming to folks. And one of the issues, I suppose, would be our demographic trend is also negative in that respect.
Right.
I don't know to what extent. I mean, we have a very low unemployment rate, which is, I suppose, from a employee standpoint, is good, because everybody who's employed has a job. But if you're an employer, and it's very, very hard to find qualified workers. So I think it's sort of a multi-headed approach that would be necessary. Perhaps some incentives, perhaps some, actually literally traveling around the country and, trying to convince folks to come here.
So I found when I was in the legislature, and still today, following everything, Vermont's legislature today, or for the past years, has not been very encouraging for tax incentives, for TIFs, for credits, for businesses. Act 250 has been a major debacle over the years. So if we don't get the mindset of the legislators to change and to understand really business and to come in pretty much unison with the want to encourage business and economic development. It's nice to say we want economic development and say, let's find one buzzword, okay, workforce development. So we'll just say, okay, we hired plumbers today. And that doesn't do it. I mean, that sounds good in the press and it gets them reelected. But if their mindset isn't really changed and Act 250 isn't changed and TIF district understanding, not just a small little TIF district and you get the TIF and then let's see what happens. I mean, there really has to be a major overhaul in this. Do you have any ideas of where you think the Ways and Means should go with this? I mean, these incentives, can you give us some input on this?
Well, I guess my first idea would be, why don't we support what we've already got so we don't lose it?
Even better.
You know, that's a good example about the aviation industry. You know, it's nothing at all against upstate New York, but, you know, when we have a homegrown business like Beta,
right,
we should be doing everything that we can to give them the supports that they need to succeed. They are high-paying, they're clean jobs, they're, you know, it's the sort of stuff that that sort of I think is very. It's the type of dream that any economic development person that works for the state of Vermont would think about. You know, whether it be, you know, aviation, whether it be aerospace, whether it be clean manufacturing. You know, we are very dependent upon the tourism industry. And I've been a national ski patroller for 55 years.
Right.
Just finished my 55th season.
Wow.
And, you know, it's when I look at back to the 1970s, when I started skiing, we didn't need snowmaking because we had so much snow. If you look at Europe right now, I mean, many of the ski areas below, say, 3,000 meters aren't able to function anymore. I think we're getting, you know, we're starting our season, our ski season here a week late from what I'm used to. We're ending it a week early from what I'm used to. And that trend, I think, is just going to continue. So, you know, working on Vermont's year-round tourism industry, again, I think we need to support that. I mean, you mentioned Act 250. We do so much to preserve the bucolic nature of our countryside, and it basically is a huge asset that we have. You know, and what else do we have a lot of? We've got really good specialty food manufacturing, whether it be cheese or milk or maple syrup or all those kinds of things. My way of thinking would be start with what you've got, hold them close, don't let them go, make it more, you know, affordable and feasible and profitable for them to stay here and do good work.
So I like that concept, and I agree with that concept, particularly in TIF districts. Okay, I think that, and this is just my own personal opinion, I believe that those areas that have been already given the TIFs, who are actually successful and able to sustain the TIFs, should be the areas that continue to be using this vehicle and redeveloped and really build up those areas, as opposed to just throwing a project TIF to one area and let's see if it works. Because if it doesn't work, then of course the legislators are going to say, see, it didn't work. But you know, you can't just say, let's give them a shot. And you can't ignore them, but there are other ways to assist the blight areas. Sometimes you have to focus more on housing or other areas and the types of workforce that go in. So in the TIF area, TIF district, I know the governor is trying to advocate for more project TIFs as opposed to a whole TIF district, which is a interesting concept and a good concept, provided the project works. So my thought, and I know it's federal, but there has to be a way for the TIFs, federal TIFs, to work for the aviation industry. I would think that that's the area you want to go into because we need the transportation. If we don't have the transportation, we don't have the manufacturing coming in internationally, we don't have that international rapport, just going in and saying, let's fix this one building is not the way to go. What's your thought on TIFs, if you have any?
Well, I think the TIFs are, again, it's a bit of a long-term play, but I do think it's part of the one of the arrows in the quiver that has proven to be effective in the state of Vermont. And I think we have, I'm from Burlington, Church Street.
Right.
You know, we have TIFs to thank largely for Church Street, but again, I think being strategic about where you set up your TIFs, again, you can't do it in the middle of nowhere.
Correct.
You know, I still think back to that Kia factory down in the middle of nowhere. And I would think that wouldn't it be nice maybe if we could have a couple of those kind of employers with 5,000 people suddenly drop into, you know, the Northeast Kingdom and to Rutland County. I'm just picking two
and
random
Rutland
places.
is starting to really develop, and they just got their TIF approved, and they're working on that. But Rutland has had their blocks already started, so there's been a lot of economic development going on there, and to continue there is a good plan.
Oh, I agree. And I also think we're sort of on the way between, when you think about regionalism, we're sort of on the way between Boston and New York on the one hand, and Washington and Canada.
Right.
And so all the more reason why, you know, not adversely impacting our relationship with our Canadian, established Canadian, you know, friends and relatives and, you know, collaborators in terms of economic development. You look at, you know, Amtrak sort of comes and goes.
Right.
But, you know, I can now walk to the train station from my house in Burlington and 8 hours later be in downtown New York City. I think sort of continuing to increase regional transportation and, you know, so that there can be, you know, traffic, let's say easy traffic between Burlington, Vermont and Montreal or Sherbrooke. Issues like that. I think that combined with not disrupting the business relationships that we currently have, and one way to disrupt is tariffs.
Tariffs.
Or the uncertainty of tariffs. You know, now you see them, now you don't.
Right, that's the issue, more so than a tariff. I mean, you know, a well thought out tariff is entirely different than, okay, put my name in the paper today, I want a tariff here, and I'm taking it back tomorrow. I mean, that's the fear that's going on.
Yeah, and I think that if you looked at the sort of global trade history, you would find that over the last, say, 100 years, we have become more free trade, not less. So the way in which the manufacturers, the service providers have essentially adapted to that is a reflection of the environment in which they were operating. And again, they didn't develop overnight. These are sometimes multi-generation type of manufacturing concerns. And so the concern is change. The concern is uncertainty. And I think that I'm a person that sort of believes in free borders. From the, I mean, there's two things that basically transit borders. One is goods and the other is people.
People.
And so they're very much related concepts. So I'm suspecting we're going to talk a little bit about immigration.
We are.
And so to the extent that you know, we can move either our goods freely or efficiently across borders, and we move ourselves for business purposes across borders, I think ultimately that's the way to optimize the amount under the integral, if you will. That's the way we optimize productivity, is by, you know, eliminating the friction.
So let's talk about that now. Let's talk about the friction. Let's talk about immigration. Let's talk about what's actually happening. People are capital, but they're also human beings, right?
Sure.
I mean, and we need them, we want them, and we have a lot of pressure going on now, a lot of fear. What is your take pretty much on what the environment and what's going on with the borders right now?
Well, you want to start with Canada?
Sure, I do.
Okay, so getting back to NAFTA, under the North American Free Trade Agreement, aside from the moving of goods at little or no tariffs, with some notable exceptions, people can actually move more easily as well. Certainly, if you're simply going to, here we are in Newport, if we're going to Montreal for a concert, traveling across the border and returning, no problem. What if we want to work in Montreal?
Right.
And the answer to that is, if we wanted to work in London, we would need probably a work visa. Now, I'm no expert in UK immigration law, but I can tell you that it would be more complicated to work in London than it would be to work in Montreal for a US citizen, because NAFTA allows something called the TN visa. TN stands for Trade NAFTA. And what it basically means is you can actually get a work visa just as you can appear at the border and say, you know, when the border folks at the Canadian immigration or whatever ask, what are you up to? You can basically present a letter of offer letter from a Canadian company, and you can demonstrate that you have the necessary academic credentials, which is essentially a bachelor's degree or the equivalent. You also have to fall within a category of list of professions. Pick one, engineering.
Sure.
And then you can be issued on the spot at the immigration office in a matter of minutes. You can be issued a one-year visa to basically work in Canada, and you can live there. You have to maintain an unrelinquished domicile in the United States, and it's for a year. But there's really no limit to the number of years you can extend, as long as you are not you are always maintaining this permanency back somewhere in the United States.
Do you know if they've changed the requirement? Do you need to be able to speak the language? You're able to speak French at this point? I know in a lot of countries they're changing that, which to get the visas you have to be able to speak the local language. Do you know if that's true?
I don't know the answer to that question. Of course, you know, I know that the Francophone legislation in Quebec has been sort of strengthened in recent years or so. Of course, if you wanted to get a job in Ontario, or if you wanted to get a job in British Columbia or something like that, that language issue would not be a problem. I don't know that it is a requirement that you speak French in order to get a TN visa to work in Montreal.
Okay, so the visa's not, but just for actually relocating it is, I think. But it might not be.
That could be as a permanent residence.
Right.
But the whole idea behind TN visas is that, you know, they make the border almost invisible for U.S., Canada, and Mexican type work. And so, you know, why did this come to pass? And arguably, it's a byproduct of the interdependence of our countries. You know, and notably, I know even less about Mexico than I know about Canada, but, you know, notably, our interdependency with Mexico has become much more around the automotive industry.
Automotive industry, right.
The maquiladoras, you know, where you basically are manufacturing cars with cheap labor, which is another interesting political issue, since you're potentially costing jobs in Detroit.
Right.
But
you're still producing.
You're producing cheaper cars.
Right, correct, and people could afford them.
Yeah, and that's when the checks and balances, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Right,
but so to the extent that I really am concerned that to the extent that whether it's tariffs or whether it's restrictions on the movement of people, restrictions on the ability of, let's say, Canadians and Americans, just to make it easy locally, to work in the other's country, those are some of the potential downsides that I see of disrupting long-standing trade practices. And specifically, you know, moving from a place of less regulation to more.
And I couldn't agree with you more. And it's compounded because once you do that disruption, it's very difficult to make amends.
Right.
I mean, once it's broken in such a personal and a political way, it's labeled. And that label is what's difficult. It's a scar. It's almost like, you know, the big A that everybody needs to wear. And right now we need the people, we need the development, we need the opportunity to be rational human beings. We need to remember that we're rational human beings, and we need to say, okay, legally these people can come in, and how do we help them legally? And so if we don't have the manpower to work here, or the workforce development in Vermont, where do we get the people from?
Well, it's a good question, and I think what you were saying at the beginning is that if you do put up barriers, each country is going to adapt appropriately, and they're going to, to the extent that they were dependent upon American goods, and the American goods have become expensive, they will find alternative sources. To the extent that they depended upon American workers, and those workers are less available, they will find local workers. And then undoing that is going to be very, very difficult. And I would simply suggest that to the extent that the free market has evolved in a particular direction in the context of a freer trade environment, I would offer the opinion that it's a reflection of the fact that this is how the market works most efficiently. And so when you suddenly you move the cheese, you start changing the rules of engagement, each country, adapts appropriately. I think that is a move in the direction of less efficiency, probably increased prices, fewer options for the consumers. And again, once you've adapted to it, if you suddenly realize, 4 years down the road, 8 years down the road, whenever, the policy makers change,
right,
that you want to go back, it's not going to be easy.
It's not going to be easy.
Right. It's not going to happen with a snap of a finger.
Well, that's right. And there will be a lot of politicizing going on and a lot of noise. And we know people like to make noise. Yep. And then they won't focus on what needs to be done. How about the trade schools? What's your thought on, with the education reform going on, where do the trade schools fit in on this?
I'm a big fan of tech centers, is what we call them here in Vermont sometimes. There's also the broader concept of alternate pathways, where, some students, not everybody needs to go to college. We have had a culture, I think, maybe if you go back 30, 40 years ago, where that was sort of the default destination. We're going to give everybody the opportunity to go to college. Some people may not make it, but we're going to put everybody on that path. I think at this point, and so why is it hard to find electricians? Why is it hard to find plumbers? When in fact they probably, in many cases, make more money than people in many other types of industry sectors. What we've been doing in the last 20 years or so in Vermont policy is incentivizing students to go to tech centers. And I think what we're finding is that it's heading us in the right direction. You look at the advertisements on TV, look at the sort of interviews of students that are basically saying, I was a 10th grader and I was an 11th grader. I was not engaged. I wasn't interested in calculus. I wasn't going to go to college, but I really wanted to, help my father in his electrician business. I wanted to become an electrician. The ability that you have as a junior to go to tech center, become an apprentice electrician, and still get credit toward graduation, and in some contexts through dual enrollment,
right,
also getting credit toward college, so that you can get, let's say, an associate's degree on top of your high school diploma, and in the meantime you sort of hit the road running, let's say at the age of 20,
right,
with a license, a professional license of a journeyman electrician or something like that. I think that the future of tech centers, of trades, is very, very important to manufacturing. I also think it's important to adult satisfaction with career opportunities. And so I'm a big supporter of it. And we have 16 tech centers in the state of Vermont. In most cases, you can only go to the one that's in your area. There are a couple of areas in Vermont where there's actually tech center choice.
Right, and that's where I was going to ask next. Like, okay, so if you can only go to the one in your area and you have school choice and you're all over, how does that fit in? Is there a disruption now to this progress of tech centers?
Well, for one thing, so the two places, I can tell you where one of the two places is where there's tech center choice, and that is in Chittenden County, because there's a Burlington Tech Center and there's an Essex Tech Center. And if you are within Chittenden County, you can choose from either.
Okay.
There's also a culture, and I think it's by State Board of Education rule, that if there is a particular program that is not offered at your career center, but is offered at a neighboring one, you can get a special dispensation and you can go to that other tech center. And then your school district basically has to pay the tuition. So for example, if you want to be in the restaurant business, but your tech center does not offer a culinary program, but the neighboring one does, you can actually access that neighboring one. Now, the issue, of course, is if you're in a rural part of the state, the next closest tech center might be an hour and a half away.
Right.
And so, but again, that problem is a derivative of the demographic implosion as opposed to, anything else. But I would strongly suggest that, technical education be made more available and more diverse. I mean, there are a couple of really cool programs. Burlington has one in aviation.
Right.
So you can actually learn how to fly. You can learn how to be an aircraft mechanic.
How to build a plane.
How to build a plane. And of course, again, we're getting back to the beta example, which is just another wonderful example of, the kind of industry we really need in Vermont. But if you're going to essentially set us on a path where you're sort of correcting the path a little bit in terms of economic development, first of all, I think it's a 50-year outlook.
Okay, sure.
And there are a number of different components, but increasing access to technical education, giving students more choice in terms of, being able to opt for an education that is going to correlate with their sense of, direction, their sense of where they want to be, who they want to be. I think that would be money well spent.
It also would open up the opportunity for more professional teachers to come in.
Yeah.
And also more alignment with the businesses. Okay,
Yep.
Programs, scholarships, internships, if the businesses are here, which actually pushes the economic development and the workforce. I think here's a question, just as, we're young ones, you're still young.
Yeah.
So you go out and you say, I'm going to not do the college route right out of high school. I'm going to go into more of the commercial area. But now I have a taste of earning a living. Do you get into my plan was I did want to go and get an engineer license. I wanted to go back to college, but I don't want to now give up my income. So how do we deal with that? That's a personal choice, and it's almost like a behavioral issue. So do you think that in the career centers we also need to have, or be sure that we have the guidance counselors there, the continual assistance from the educators to make sure that it's not, okay, here you go, you're now a plumber. Because sometimes people, kids have dreams. So they want to be in the entertainment business. They want to be, film producers. They want to do one of the apps for, all the different kinds of games. And they're great at it.
Right.
So you don't want to take away their dream, the fact that they can dream.
Right.
And you don't want them just going to a tech center because their dad needs them to take over the business.
Right.
Okay, so you want the blend.
Right. And you certainly don't want them going to tech center because I can't make it in the normal academic world.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, the idea of the core courses, whether it's math or English language arts or social studies or science or whatever, is typically embedded in many of the tech types of offerings. But no, I completely agree that, if a kid graduates from high school or drops out of high school, goes into the workforce and suddenly realizes my passion is something else,
Right.
I think that the education world and the policymakers and the manufacturing world and the service world, they all need to be talking so that the education offerings can essentially be not, I would say, tailored, but can be essentially informed by what the perceived industry needs are. And so, if there's a particular direction in which we're going. I mean, maybe there's going to be less in the way of ski area management.
Right.
Maybe there's going to be more in the way of aviation. Maybe there's going to be more in the way of AI. But certainly the industry and the education policymakers need to be talking and need to have alternative pathways available. And I think that ultimately, many of these manufacturers would gladly assist financially if they thought that they were going to get a highly improved workforce out of the deal.
They assist when they go after the college-bound students.
Sure.
So why not promote that? Our administration, I know they're working on workforce development. They've got new groups new boards and commissions. They need to focus on that as well. They need to put together those alliances. But get into the schools so that the students understand it's not, I have to choose this because I can't do college. That's not true.
Right.
I mean, people mature later on when they're ready to do the academic world sometimes. And, and it's a long time to go from kindergarten all the way, for the 12 years, right? I mean, people burn out.
Well, here's an outrageous idea. In many parts of the world, high school ends at about age 16.
Right.
And so are we, keeping kids in high school too long? Or should they be sort of introduced to the workforce, introduced to career opportunities earlier? And so there are certain policies that have been put in place, such as the dual enrollment,
right?
Which is basically something that you do in your senior year. But you can also do it during your junior year.
Right.
And there's actually even pre-tech that is available in 9th and 10th grade under state administrative regulations under appropriate circumstances. Now, they don't want to create an environment where it is, where kids can, lose their childhood.
Right.
But, I went to college at a very young age because I went to high school and grade school overseas. And I don't think that there was any sort of downside for me being sort of introduced to my next steps at an early age. So I think that we need to inform our economic policies with a full understanding of the relationship between the workforce and the education community and the needs of manufacturing and service industry.
And the whole private government separation needs to be united. And so otherwise it won't work.
Absolutely.
Because I remember as well, and I was in high school, I wanted to, they had what was called the commercial division if you didn't want to do the academic division. And when, if I went to talk to somebody there, if that was a choice I was interested in, you couldn't just do that. I mean, it was like, no, you're academically bound. You need to stay here. And so, but I did have the option to graduate early. And so you graduate early and then you do what you want. But the key is, it needs to be more united.
Yes.
And it also needs to be more for the students to understand it's not taking away their dreams. It's helping them get to their dreams with a real path. Right. So I think that is crucial for Vermont, and I think Vermont's prime right now to start that. They had the idea going. The governor had what was it? Birth to cradle to, I forgot what he calls it. I apologize. But the cradle path to. I'm so sorry. I forgot what he called it.
It's not quite to the grave, but I know
cradle.
right.
Yeah, right. It's not to the grave, right? But it's a good concept. But the key is, what are the programs that actually make it happen?
Right.
And that's important. So I'm going to ask you now to talk about the one area that you would really like to let our constituents know is important to you.
Well, what you were just, before I maybe get into that, what you were just saying made me think about some of the, what I would call futurizing work that's been done by the state of Vermont over the course of, the last 50 years. I know that there are a couple of quarter-inch thick reports that have been generated. I think there was one in the late 60s. I think there was one in the mid 70s. there's a sense that, these are sort of think tanky type things about what's the direction of Vermont. I really think those are useful exercises. The public reaction to some of it is to sort of look at the directory, look at the book, and say, I can't believe what they were really thinking back in 1969, that they thought this was going to work, or in 1985. However, I think the idea of futurizing is always important. It's like having a direction is always important. Having a goal. You may not achieve that goal, you may not get to that where you're going, but because suddenly as you're halfway there, you realize there's a sharp right that you want to take to get to a slightly different place. But it's so important to have goals, less important to achieve them, because they keep you propelled in a direction, keep you moving, keep you developing, and I think that we need to do more futurizing.
I agree with you there. I think the key with that too, though, is that not only do we need these think tank studies, and if they're coming out of, say, the legislature, it's the reason for them. So it shouldn't be just, well, we don't want to rule on this bill or make a decision, so let's just throw it into a study.
Right.
It really needs to be a developed plan, and then we need to hear, the public needs to hear what those outcomes were, what the ideas were, not just, we did a study, okay, so we didn't have to make a decision and kick the can down the road. Right. So I think the key there is we do need to look to the future, and then we need to look to the past in those studies and see where they were going, because maybe we didn't get there, but it doesn't mean it wasn't opening the door telling us to go back and revisit it and look at it now.
Absolutely. No, I think what you're getting at is that sometimes the legislature can be criticized for, doing a study in lieu of making a hard decision.
Correct.
And I'm thinking of, and again, maybe I know that's sort of happened this session with respect to the education issues. Right. I was just telling somebody recently that, how far in front of yourself are you looking? And I'll make the analogy for skiing. If you're looking one mogul in front of yourself, your outlook is too near. On the other hand, if you're looking 20 yards or 50 yards down the path, your trajectory, I think, will be smoother. And I do think that what I would differentiate are these sort of legislative studies that are intended to sort of avoid a hard decision this year, punt to next year, correct, versus having that 50-year outlook. And I know, for example, that we've talked about one of the areas in which long-term planning has been on the news recently, has to do with energy standards. Right. And do we want to be all electric, or are we going to basically be decreasing our carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. And as liberal as I am, and as living in the most liberal state that I live in, I do think that we really need to emphasize in these challenging times, we need to emphasize, sort of economic development, not at the cost of our green hills, not at the cost of safety and so on and so forth. But, I just think that we're going into a period of history where it's going to be important to be careful, to make sure that coming generations have the same, or let's say as much of the same opportunities that we've had growing up. I'm sure that those of us of a certain age who look back and say, is my economic situation as good as my parents' was? Maybe. They certainly had a much better outcome than their parents. I mean, my father was a refugee from the Holocaust, and he came here with nothing. He made a good life. Certainly made a good life for me. I am concerned about the next generation. At this point, the next generation are basically 40-year-old people, okay? My kids, right, and their kids. Right. And I am less confident that the quality of their life experience, however you want to measure that, is going to be better than mine, and the next generation better yet. So I think we do have to live more. We have to anticipate living more lightly, if you will, and plan on that. And so, I think we can increase the economic sort of comfort level of manufacturing and service industries in Vermont without sacrificing any of the
balance
things
of
that
life and-
I don't think so.
Right.
And driving up here from Burlington, I mean, there's so much space this morning.
There you go. You look and you say, gee, we have like vast land here. What do we need to do? But I think transportation's got to be key there.
Transportation is key.
Is key to it. It can't just be, okay, well, we'll just come back and look at this in an isolated way. Nothing can be done in a silo anymore.
Right.
And that's why my thought was that we have to really look at what's already started to be developed and finished, having that become developed, and then go into the next area, as opposed to, okay, a little bit for you, a little bit for you, and then it just never happens.
Right. Giving people $10,000 to relocate a family of 4 to Vermont, I don't think is a very effective technique.
I mean, it was a nice suggestion, but unless it comes with more of a package,
right,
or more of a tie to a business and an actual opportunity for a specific housing area or job opportunities, it's just not going to happen.
Right.
And so by developing different areas and really making sure we continue to do that, we're also going to attract the people who are coming who have spouses who really want to continue to work.
Right.
I mean, you know, we have that whole issue with spouses. It's like, well, I'll give up my career and then we'll come there. And it was like, I'm really glad you love Vermont, but I'm out of here. You want to come with me? Come with me. And so, you know, it's a shock for people who are coming from cities or coming from different states. And, you know, they're used to all different marketing concepts, all different job opportunities. They think it's going to be wonderful because they had a great weekend in a cabin here. Right. But when you come to really decide if you're going to move here, are they really getting the information they need?
Right, and when you look at this concept of urbanization, seems to me it's a local phenomenon, it's a statewide phenomenon, it's a national phenomenon, and apparently it's a global phenomenon. People are moving more into the cities. And so what that's doing to the rural areas is just making them much more economically challenged.
Deprived, right?
And so I think that we ought to recognize that we have the most incredible rural parts here in our state. We simply have to make opportunities available. And again, it's that's why we have to continuously keep planning and having the right stakeholders at the table, which is, you know, basically industry, education, and policymaking.
That's right. And we know that when we have the right stakeholders at the table, we also have to remember who decides where they come from. So we have X amount appointed, say, from a governor. We have X amount appointed from the legislature, right? We also have, and this is something I'm not so thrilled about, we have legislators on these committees. I'm not so into that right now. That's kind of, I question that. I think they do their policy work. It belongs in the legislature. They should, you know, they're there to be spoken to. People can speak to them. But I think that the business people need to have more of a say in there. They should have more appointees that way. I think that's where we're moving right now.
Well, it's interesting that I was just thinking about like the JFO,
right?
The Joint Fiscal Office.
Correct.
I mean, so the question that I used to have when I worked across the street from the legislature and spent many of my days testifying in front of House Ed and Senate Ed and committees like that was when I think about economic development, I know that there are a handful of economists that advise the governor, that advise the legislature. But I wonder sometimes whether we could not perhaps put more into that, you know, fiscal operations, whether they're internal to government or whether we use more sort of economic consultants.
Correct. To
sort of get us into a better direction. Because, you know, when I've said 2 or 3 times already, I'm not a macroeconomist, I think maybe we need more of those, or we need to access their knowledge. Access
their knowledge, and I think that, you know, I mean, I believe the governor has the ability to do special appointments and consultants that way. Of course, budget's always going to be an issue.
Sure.
But I think that the people who are out here with that expertise want to help.
Right.
I think they see their own expertise, they see the need, and they could be really great consultants. But then again, you know, we're always dealing with political issues that are going to control and budgetary issues. But I think we need that. I think we need those appointments, the consultants, we need the expertise. Right. And we shouldn't be afraid of it.
Right.
You know, you don't have to do what they say, but you definitely want to tap their brains. I mean, they're think tanks. They've experienced it. You know, they lived it. They've studied it. And that's nothing to run away from, especially if we have that talent.
Right, and it's interesting because the way you were talking about, you know, putting legislators on committees, nothing wrong with putting legislators on study committees, but are they the right people?
Correct.
Or are they simply being put on the committee because, you know, they need to be there? I would almost rather just have economic development advisory committees be purely sort of scientific.
I'm with you.
If you will, theoretical, academic.
Right.
And yeah, so you know.
Yeah, and I have an issue with the legislators being put on the committees, number one, because are they the right people? Well, I don't think they belong there. It's a study from people with expertise in the area. And it's also a way to give them compensation, and it's always going to come from leadership. Whoever controls, they're going to pick the people that they want to vote the way they want to vote. And that's not what this is about.
Right.
This is not about, come on out and, you know, make sure you vote my way and I'll make sure you get $200 for the summer. Right. That's not the way it should be working. Right. So I'm going to ask you now, give me your final area you want to talk about before we wrap up.
Boy, final area that I want to talk about.
Because you're wonderful. This is great, and I'm going to beg you to come back.
Well, I think I may need some more tips. I mean, give me a direction.
Okay, so I really like the aviation area right now because I think the transportation aviation coming in with types of businesses that could be anchors in the different airports that we have, the whole beta issue. Should the airports be privatized? Should they, you know, be taken away from possibly the state? Does the business have to purchase them? We have one going on right now, right? So how do the airports develop? How they want to. The people want it to develop. The key is, how do you get around all of the state budget, the state's decision on which airport should be developed? How do we service? I mean, we've got Massachusetts who could fly right into here if we had it, the right airport structure. We've got Caledonia, down by Rutland, right? We have Rutland's airport, the small airports. We have, how do we get that area to force economic development and businesses to come here?
Well, it's interesting, and again, I hate to come back to beta all the time, but I mean, to the extent that our local airports might be much more in demand in the context of sort of short distance, like delivery models and so on and so forth, like the movement of goods. I understand that the beta planes have a payload of something like 1,400 pounds along that line. I tend to be a private sector person. I don't know too much about, the government operation of airports and so on and so forth. But I completely agree with you. Transportation is key. Making Vermont accessible, not just economically, but also in terms of whether it's, getting here by rail.
I wish we had more rail.
Making sure that the interstates, Route 7, that corridor. Right. I've always heard that there was some money that we left on the table, that there was going to be a west side 4-lane highway that was partially, there was some money Congress had allocated for that we've never taken advantage of. So I think that making Vermont accessible, here's one of my own nits. It's really frustrating to me that the direct flights to New York City have been limited from Burlington. Right. When you think about the extent to which business can now operate remotely, easily, I think that's really the kind of stuff we want to encourage. And so there's sort of an accident that I'm not sure we've taken adequate advantage of yet, which is the concept of remote working, the idea that you can essentially do the same job, living in Burlington, Vermont, as you might do if you lived in New York City. And then you can have all the benefits of living in a place like Vermont. So I think education, transportation, and maybe that's one of the issues in terms of the futurizers. Energy. Getting, populating this think tank right? The standing think tank, maybe de-emphasizing legislative involvement. I mean, they do a lot for very little money. Well, but they do a lot for very little money. But so let the experts, sit and think about this. So alternative education, more robust transportation, maintaining environment, being realistic about, how far down the ski slope we look in terms of planning our route, and taking advantage of the success stories that we already have and trying to help those folks succeed to the next level.
So let's talk about taking advantage of the success stories. We also deal with the news. They don't like success stories. That doesn't sell papers, right? And so we need to get that out there. We need to know our success stories. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we get that whole marketing going? I think we need to deal with our tourist people from the state to really get more marketing out there, not just the political advantage, but what's really going on. Here's a success story. And I believe the governor is doing his best to go down with his administration to go and see the different businesses, but those are the local businesses. What about the businesses that are in development right now? What about the deals that need to happen? I think the people need to hear more about that so that they have that security and comfort level, because why do you want to move here?
Right.
And how do you move here? Where do you move if you don't know where the success stories are?
Well, I think it's interesting that we have a governor right now who has a track record of a lot of success in industry. He knows, what that's all about. I think one of the things that we need to re-emphasize maybe is sort of the economic development portion of state government. With all of the, stuff that happened at J-Peak.
Right.
I don't know this for a fact, but I think we are spending a little less resources in terms of trying to bring industry into the state of Vermont.
I agree.
And I think it was kind of an accident because, we got burned by that. And I would also say that I was involved in the EB5 business back in the early days.
Okay.
And it had tremendous benefits for the state of Vermont. It brought in investors, it increased infrastructure. There's no reason why we can't get back to a responsible EB5 type environment. Again, it's only one sort of strand.
Right, that's right. The one bad apple.
We used to have 2 FTE International Trade Office. I think we probably now have 1 because we no longer have. Vermont used to boast that it was the only state in the union that had a state-run EB5 office.
Right, not anymore.
And I don't think we do have that anymore. But I think that it would be a good area in which to inject a little bit more effort, a little bit more money. And I think I mentioned to you when we were getting ready this morning, this Vermont International Trade Alliance.
Right, I'd like to hear about that.
I think that, just again, having more multifaceted groups talking about economic development. I mentioned that I'm the Export Legal Assistance Network representative for the state of Vermont.
That's fantastic.
I mean, it's a program put on by the Federal Bar Association where international trade lawyers devote, low-cost initial consultations for emerging businesses and businesses that are looking to expand their international footprint, whether it's import, export, foreign investment. I think that that's the direction that we should be headed, I think I am cautiously optimistic that that this period of sort of international trade chaos that we're finding ourselves in is going to be a short-term phenomenon, and I am quite confident in the ultimate strength of our economy, and I think that we will rebound fast when that happens. And if for some reason we can start decreasing barriers globally as a result of this sort of fit that's been thrown,
then we win.
Then ultimately we will win, but there'll be some pain between now and then.
Right.
And I'm afraid that the pain is going to be inflicted on those that are least able to really deal with it.
Right. And then, we know historically, right, even from myths, out of chaos comes order.
Absolutely. And opportunity.
Right. And so we need to remember that. But you're right. The key is who's going to carry the pain. Yeah. And can we, as the United States and as, the people here, can we figure out how to lessen that burden? And, we have to also be careful. We don't want the silos of the not-for-profits, and, you can't, you don't know who's in them and how that works. That's an entirely different topic we'll talk about. But right now, the key is we can make it going forward, provided we strengthen our international relationships, and we don't inhibit them, and we don't put up these walls and these barriers, and we work together for both sides, and we produce jobs, appropriate jobs, and then because then we can get the skilled workers, and then the housing comes in. It's not build the houses, they will come. That's not how it works realistically.
No.
But educate our future generations with these trade schools and even college, whatever it is, and give them the opportunity. And transportation to me is the key. I mean, if you can't get there,
right.
So what if it's there?
Right. Well, there's a combination of increasing transportation and then increasing sort of virtual transportation.
Virtual transportation as well.
By the good news that we're dealing under now, which is that you can now pretty much do anything you need to do anywhere.
That's right.
And so that's an opportunity that needs to be harnessed. I'm not a big believer in work from home, but that's because of the work that I tend to do.
Right.
But I think it's a huge opportunity. Like my next door neighbors, they work from home. They're engineers.
Right.
You're young engineers that have a combined, very good income, I'm sure, and living in the most lovely state in the union, and having good jobs of the sort that they could not afford to have if they were doing bricks and mortar work here. But, so let us move freely, sort of communication-wise, transportation-wise, cross-border-wise. Hopefully the trade war is a temporary phenomenon.
Right, hopefully.
But again, we fundamentally, and I'm an optimist, maybe to a fault. And I honestly think that we have a very, very robust economy. We're going to do just fine, but we have to keep planning for the future.
Right, I agree with you. Well, I have to thank you. You have been a phenomenal guest,
it's been a lot of fun.
I'm going to beg you to come back. So, any last words?
No, thank you. It's been really appreciate you bringing us up here, and it was a beautiful day for a drive, and happy to come back anytime.
Thank you. Do you just want to tell our public just a little bit about your entire law firm? And we can do that if you like.
Well, let me do
whatever
quickly. Yes,
into,
I'm a lawyer in Burlington. One of the interesting things about the practice of law, which I've sort of shared with a lot of young lawyers, is that back when I started practicing 45 years ago, there were far too many lawyers in Vermont chasing too little work. Now it's the opposite. The pandemic caused a lot of people my generation to retire, and the demographics, I think, are just such that new lawyers coming in are face a career where they're going to be turning away work. I also want to put in just a quick pitch, since you're giving me the opportunity.
This is it.
One of the pieces that I do is called is to develop a World Court of Human Rights. Those of you that follow what are called supranational courts have heard of the International Court of Justice, which is a UN organ that essentially adjudicates disputes between and among nation states on matters of treaties and conventions. Then there's the International Criminal Court that focuses on criminal prosecutions arising out of things like crimes against humanity, genocide, that type of thing. But there is no global system for adjudicating human rights issues. And there's a inter-American regional court, there is a European court, and there is a transnational African court. There's nothing in Asia, which is 60% of the world's population, probably 90% of the world's human rights violations. And so as early as 1947, the year before the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, discussion began about a World Court of Human Rights to try and normalize nation-state behaviors around human rights. It's been an objective for the last 80 years or so, and we think we finally got traction. I'm the director of an organization that has produced a statute which would create the third leg of that transnational, intranational court stool. And it would also probably put a regional court of human rights in Asia. But then what it would do is basically sit on top of the human rights organs, the regional organs, and create a jurisprudence that would inform, things like, what should happen in Gaza, what should happen in Ukraine, what does public international law tell us about the most fundamental type of legal rights there are, which are human rights.
Human rights.
Whether it's a right to be safe, it's a right not to be enslaved, it's a right to basic, sufficient food and basic health care and housing and things like that. So that's one of the things that I'm doing in this sort of fifth quarter of my career, if you will. And maybe at some point we could have a discussion about that in a later date.
Absolutely, we definitely can. And you heard him, he said he'd come back. So I want to thank you. This is Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan. We have Mark Ottinger. Thank you so much. You've been phenomenal.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Watch for the show to air. Thank you.
Take care.